Our stronghold is God will take out. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to the Lord. Now there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem at the Sheep Gate a pool, called in Hebrew Bethesda, with 5 porticos. In these lay a large number of ill, blind, lame, and crippled. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been ill for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm on my way, someone else gets down there before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your mat and walk." Immediately the man became well, took up his mat, and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to carry your mat." He answered them, "The man who made me well told me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who told you, 'Take it up and walk'?" The man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away, since there was a crowd there. After this, Jesus found him in the temple area and said to him, "Look, you are well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went and told the Jews that Jesus was the one who had made him well. Therefore the Jews began to persecute Jesus, because he did this on the Sabbath. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. So something I was talking about on Sunday with some of our students from Wabash, and something we're talking about this semester when we have our meetings on Wednesday evenings, we talk about formation, is we've been talking about how we are living in basically a change of the ages. That you and I, whether we realize it or not, the way that we see the world, the civilization we are a part of, the culture which we are members of, we are living in a civilization which is basically a product of something that happened about 400 years ago. So about 400 years ago, there was a man named Copernicus and another man named Galileo. And basically, they were commissioned by the Holy Father to work on the calendar, because our calendar was not completely accurate. So the Vatican invested a lot of money in astronomers to basically reevaluate the solar system model that everyone believed, right? Which was, of course, the geocentric model, right? With the Earth being in the center of the solar system and all the planets and even the sun orbiting around the Earth. And as you know, Copernicus and Galileo basically convinced everyone that the opposite was true. And even though they weren't able to prove it, over the course of time, this became the dominant theory in science. This is something that scientists and historians, they call the Copernican Revolution. The Copernican Revolution. And the reason why it was a revolution is because it was a finding that did not simply change science. It changed basically the whole way that people saw the world. In Europe, there was a Christian culture, and it was built around the idea that God had created the world in an orderly fashion, and that God continues to work within the world by means of the church and the saints. The idea of a deistic God, right, that many of us are familiar with, like the founding fathers of the United States, right? They believed in a deistic God, somebody who just created the world and then left it alone. That didn't really come about until after this Copernican revolution. The idea was that God was still very active in the world, and that the world was created in an orderly fashion. So when we think about science, the most basic idea is that the world has a certain predictability to it, an order to it. But not just science, but when you think about morality, how are we supposed to live? The idea was that God had created human beings in a similar fashion. And so when we talk about morality, it's not just about obeying God's command, it's about living the way that we were designed to live. And so when the Copernican revolution took place, it began to completely change how people began to see the world. And it took time for this to happen. And I would say that we are basically in the last legs of this Copernican revolution. Think about, for example, one of the things you'll hear today, one of the most common ideas in our culture is that science has somehow displaced religion. We no longer have need for God because of all that we have learned from science. That has reversed those old medieval ways of seeing the world. But it hasn't just affected science. It has affected morality. One of the reasons why so many people disdain the teachings of the Bible or the teaching of the church today is because they basically have the idea of, who is the church to tell me how I am supposed to live? The underlying principle there is that there is no correct way to live. There is no meaning or design to human existence. Everyone just creates it for themselves. It's affected politics. In the Middle Ages, there was the idea that governments had a certain divine protection, or at the very least that people who were ruling in governments, they should see their responsibility as a responsibility under God. And we are far from that today. And that's why we've seen so much political upheaval in the last 200 years, right? Beginning with the French Revolution, this overturning of politics. And obviously we don't believe that's all bad or anything like that, but it's just to make the point, right? So much of it has changed. Perhaps the most recent development of the Copernican revolution is the way that it has affected how people see God and the church and even the Bible. One of the outcrops of this Copernican revolution is that if everything we thought about science and politics and morality has been turned on its head, maybe everything we thought we knew about the Bible should be turned on its head. And so this began to pick up a lot of steam in the 1800s and the rise of something that scholars call liberal theology. Liberal theology is not a political description. It basically just means that some of the key doctrines or the key ideas that people understood about the Bible are now up for debate and are now questioned. And it's not just that they're up for debate, but at least in academia, it's basically accepted that the Bible should be torn apart and questioned and viewed with a skeptical eye. And some examples of this that maybe you don't even realize. That, for example, when I was going through seminary, when I was reading the Old Testament, and we were learning about that, and we were learning about the first 5 books of the Old Testament, nobody ever told me that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Even though that was the common teaching, right, all through Judaism and through Christianity up until the 1800s. Now, scholars say that we have no idea who wrote it. As a matter of fact, there's probably multiple authors. As a matter of fact, it probably wasn't written around the time of Moses. It was probably written like 1,500 years later. And so how can we really believe anything that's in it if somebody's writing it so many years after the fact? People started to do the same thing with the prophets. And even though in early Christianity, the early Christians used the prophecies of the Old Testament as one of the ways to convince people of the reality of Christianity, now in our modern age, scholars basically take the principle of, well, we know prophecy can't really happen. It's impossible. We know God doesn't actually do that. And so now these prophetical books of the Old Testament are torn apart. And that's why you hear people saying things like, instead of the prophet Isaiah prophesied this or that thing, and you'll hear about 1st Isaiah, and 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd and 4th and 5th Isaiah, right? There's more and more authors. And if there's so many authors to the text, how can we really believe anything that's in it? And then scholars have begun to question parts of the New Testament. And so again, when I was in seminary, one of the things that my New Testament professor, who himself proclaimed himself as a liberal theologian, whenever we would study the New Testament, we weren't asking, what does it mean? The question was always, did this or that author actually write this? And as a matter of fact, he used to say things like the Gospel of John was probably not even written by John the evangelist. He actually told us in class one day that it probably wasn't even written or finished until about 400 years after the death of Jesus. And on it goes. The reason why I'm bringing all this up is because you and I, whether we realize it or not, we are deeply impacted by this Copernican revolution. And so many of us, we take these ideas, and even though we might, when we come to church on Sundays, right, we might profess something different, we can't help but be influenced by this worldview. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. That basically you try to convince yourself that something is true, even though all of your experience tells you that it's false. It's one of the reasons why so many people leave the faith, especially when they go to college. They're basically, it's like the last nail in the coffin for this. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up this morning, besides the fact that I think it's extremely significant for all of us to recognize this, is that what I think is exciting about our time is we are actually beginning to see a reversal of the Copernican revolution. We are basically at the beginning stages of the Copernican revolution actually being reversed, and the pendulum switching back in the other direction. And, you might think that I'm crazy for saying this when you watch the news and you look at our culture, right, and you see how crazy everything's getting. But the reality is that at least among scholars, the more that we learn, the more we're actually beginning to realize that maybe all those people in the Middle Ages were not so naive and ignorant. We're beginning to see it in science, for example, with the discovery of the Big Bang. The Big Bang proves that the world had a beginning, which begs the question that somebody must have created it. Scholars are finding that the more we learn about the universe, the more we're learning about how perfectly ordered and put together it is. It's called the fine-tuning principle. It's becoming very clear that however the universe came to be, it could not have just been some random process. It's too perfectly designed to be that way. Scholars, even in academia and peer-reviewed journals, they're even beginning to question evolution. And again, you might be saying, how come I've never heard this? Well, it's because it takes time for these ideas to influence the scholars on the forefront of this knowledge, and then for it to get passed down through graduate schools and into universities and down to the average layperson who's not a specialist in these things. But it is beginning to happen. And the same thing is happening with theology, and especially with the Bible. The more that archaeologists are learning, the more things they're digging up in the Holy Land, the more they're realizing just how historically accurate the Bible is compared to other ancient documents. And one example we heard from this morning, from the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, perhaps more than any other book in the New Testament, is questioned as historically reliable. And one of the reasons why it is believed to be that way is because there are a number of things in the Gospel of John that are very unique, and they're not talked about in other places in the New Testament or in other ancient documents. One of the most famous examples was this Solomon's portico, or the Bethesda pool, which we read about this morning. The man who was paralyzed for 38 years and was laying beside this pool of Bethesda. And scholars for so long, right, they read this passage and say, we never even heard of this pool of Bethesda. And why would it have 5 porticos? It's a square structure. So why would there be 5 doors? And it just so happens that about 30 years ago, archaeologists actually were digging in the Holy Land, and they found this pool of Bethesda. And sure enough, it had 5 porticos. And what's perhaps even more striking about it is that it was basically covered up when Jerusalem was captured and burned in the year 70 AD. Which means that whoever wrote this Gospel of John could not have been somebody living 400 years later. It had to be somebody who was right there, right during the time of Jesus, at least before 70 AD. Otherwise, he would have had no idea that this place even existed. And this is just one of many findings. This is happening, it seems like, every other month in the Holy Land. They're finding some new discovery which is corroborating the veracity of the Bible. And I think this is just going to keep happening more and more. And who knows how long it's going to take to trickle down and to actually make an impact in our culture. But at least at the highest echelons of scholarship, this Copernican revolution is being reversed. And I think it's very exciting that we are at the beginning stages of this reversal. And I predict that maybe in 50 or 100 years, our culture is actually going to go and swing back to having more of a view that's more close to the Middle Ages than the secular view that we are experiencing today.